One problem is the chronology. It happens to be the other way around. The bombing was the cause of the atrocities. It was not a consequence of them. We have extensive documentation of this, one of the most richly documented cases in history. 2 huge State Department publications, United Nations reports, monitors on the ground, British parliamentary inquiry, and they all say the same thing. It was an unpleasant place until the bombing, but the bombing set off the atrocities. And in fact, if you look at the indictment of Milosevic for the crimes in Kosovo, you look closely, you'll notice that with a single exception, they all follow the bombing, because that's when the atrocities took place. Furthermore, it was anticipated. The General Wesley Clark, informed Washington a couple of weeks earlier in a discussion about what would happen, that if NATO, meaning the United States, did bomb, of course the Serbs would react with atrocities on the ground. He also informed the press as the bombing began that it was predictable that there would be a sharp increase in atrocities. So these horror stories you've seen are real, but they're the consequence of the intervention. So that's one problem. That one is easily handled just by suppressing the historical record. Almost totally suppressed, richly documented, almost nothing about it. There was another problem, that the traditional victims of intervention vigorously objected. There was a major meeting shortly after of the South Summit, that's basically the non-aligned countries, about 80% of the world's population, and they bitterly condemned what they called the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, referring to Kosovo, which they described as simply old-fashioned imperialism in a new guise. Well, that one could also be handled. It wasn't reported. A few mentions of it were derided, but it did cause a slight problem. One problem was that the notion humanitarian intervention was somewhat tainted in insignificant parts of the world, namely 80% of the world, but it was a little hard to maintain. So the intellectual classes had to ride to the rescue with some new notion. And the new notion is what's called responsibility to protect, R2P. That was concocted right after Serbia to try to deal with this problem. Well, that's, I should say that Kosovo is also regarded as a precedent. The recent debate over bombing, not much of a debate over bombing Syria, did point out that it would be illegal but legitimate because international law has changed. And many commentators, even the President of France, pointed out that international law is a flexible notion. It changes as a result of actions that are taken, actions of state that set precedents. And the United States set a precedent by bombing Kosovo. Actually, this is not quite accurate. So, for example, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, that didn't set a precedent. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, of course, not a precedent. And what is really meant in this discussion is when the most powerful and violent states carry out an action, those who are in a position to control and shape the way history is presented, that sets a precedent. That's the reality of it. Nevertheless, there was a problem. You needed something new. R2P, responsibility to protect, came along, constantly invoked. It's claimed to be legitimate because it was supported by the United Nations, which is about half true. There was a recent article you may have seen in the New York Times by Michael Ignatieff lauding humanitarian R2P and saying we have to invoke it. There's a book about him by Derek, which you should look at, recent book on this great humanitarian. Ignatieff, like others, had to ignore a slight problem here, too. There are two versions of R2P. One of them, in fact, was adopted by the United Nations, 2005. UN General Assembly adopted a responsibility to protect doctrine. But that one has a condition. It says it has to be within the framework of the United Nations Charter. So you can have intervention to protect people, but only on the condition that it is either authorized by the Security Council or that it's an immediate response to an ongoing armed attack. Otherwise, as illegitimate as before. Fortunately, there's another version of R2P. That's the one that the West appeals to while appealing to the UN for legitimacy. The second one is the concept developed by a commission led by Gareth Evans, Prime Minister of Australia, who's a noted violent interventionist himself. But this one is the operative version of R2P. It's the same as the UN version with one exception. It has a paragraph stating that in the event that the Security Council does not agree on the use of force, regional organizations can carry out military intervention within the area of their jurisdiction, subject to subsequent authorization by the General Assembly, by the United Nations. Well, there's only one regional organization that can do this, namely NATO, and its area of jurisdiction is the world. So what the U.S., the Western version, the operative version, the Ignatieff version and others, what that says is that NATO can do whatever it likes, independent of international law. Take, say, Libya. Libya is an African state. It's within the African Union. That's the regional organization. They were not silent about the bombing of Libya. They were strongly opposed to it. You didn't read it here, but they were strongly opposed. The African Union gave a series of proposals, sensible proposals, for diplomacy and negotiations to try to achieve the end of the civil strife without leading to a humanitarian crisis, as the bombing in fact did. Well, they were disregarded. They are not the kind of regional organization that is authorized to take a position under the responsibility to protect doctrine. Libya, as you know, is now a total ruin. You can read about it in the paper this morning. It's such a disaster that they've even had to stop exporting oil almost entirely. Well, the fact is that whatever term is used, the accepted canon of humanitarian intervention, the one accepted here, at Harvard by distinguished intellectuals, by Western powers, that's the one that authorizes aggression and violence by the powerful, whatever name is given to it. That's official history. The real history is an annoyance which is easily ignored if we, of course, allow it to be ignored.
So there you go. That was Noam Chomsky 3 weeks ago. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back at the weekend with For All That, and I've got some good guests lined up for the Scottish Independence podcast, and we'll go back to our interview shows in the next couple of weeks. So, speak to you next time.